The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, thank you so much for the honour to rise today and talk on this on the incident that happened yesterday. Mr. Speaker, for years I worked towards my dream of becoming a member of Parliament because I knew it was an opportunity for me to at least try to change people's lives and have an impact on our country. I hold this House in high regard. I hold all members of this House in high regard. And indeed, in my very first speech in the House, I offered that I was looking forward to working collaboratively with members from all sides of the House, and offered my hand even at that time that while I may hold their feet to the fire during debate and on times of seriousness and when we need to, that I also would offer my hand across the way when they needed help in terms of personal struggle. And indeed, yesterday was great to see our colleague from Scarborough Agincourt in the House, and I know that he's fighting his own battles, and it was great to see him here this week. Mr. Speaker, I've sat in this House only for a few short months, and I will be very honest with you in terms of the respect and disrespect that we've seen across the way by the Prime Minister over the last 6 months. And I will also be honest with you that he has afforded me time outside of this House when I've had constituents in that want to meet with him. He's been very respectful, and he has offered us a considerable amount of his time. I know his schedule is hectic. But frankly, Mr. Speaker, I was embarrassed and ashamed to have been witness to the conduct of our Prime Minister yesterday. His behaviour was appalling, unacceptable, and frankly shocking. To see anyone angrily striding across the floor like that, elbowing another colleague, is deplorable. But, Mr. Speaker, that is what we're talking about today. We have witnessed on this side his actions over the last 6 months. Indeed, earlier on, when our colleague from Alberta was talking about a constituent that was in her office that was losing her house, their house, because they were out of work, and near tears while she was relaying this question, I witnessed the Prime Minister smiling and laughing. We have witnessed the Prime Minister sticking his tongue out at members of the opposition. We have witnessed him saying snide remarks about members of the opposition. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? There are times for jabs. There are times for partisan jabs back and forth, and you know, we have all been part and parcel of that. But our Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, should be held to a higher account. And the conduct is unbecoming of somebody holding that office. Mr. Speaker, when our Prime Minister angrily charged across the floor, and he did, he shouted swear words. He was using language unbecoming of this House. I heard it, but I also saw members of both sides get engaged in some heated discussion. I saw members come across the floor, and I too entered to try and break it up and make sure that none of us did something that we would regret later on. But, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about the Prime Minister today and the actions that are unbecoming of a Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I am a small business owner, and if I had seen any of my employees doing the exact same thing, they would have been fired on the spot. We talk about workplace violence. We talk about domestic violence. And we see our Prime Minister that is angry. He is angered, and he is definitely striding across the floor to show us who's boss, to assert his authority. It's unacceptable. Parliament should be the pinnacle of democracy. We as members of Parliament should and are held to a higher standard. Leadership starts from the top, Mr. Speaker. That seat sets the tone for all, not just his side, but our side. That seat sets the tone for all parliamentarians. Yesterday, the Prime Minister showed a complete and utter disregard for the institution and for all Canadians with his actions and behaviour. Mr. Speaker, throughout the day, we heard shouts from the other side that the opposition was irrelevant. Irrelevant, Mr. Speaker. And then, motion 6. Unacceptable. Again, just part and part of the actions of this Prime Minister that has authority now, and he's going to show us who's boss. He's going to show Canada who's boss. Right now, outside these doors, there are school tours going on, and there were school tours here yesterday, Mr. Speaker. How is that an example for these new school kids, these kids that are coming here to watch what we do? Does he say it's okay to conduct himself in this manner and then stand and make more excuses for it? Mr. Speaker, the offender never intended to hurt somebody. A drunk driver never intends to kill people. But the fact of the matter is, the offense happened. How can we leave the next generation in a better position to succeed in the future if the Prime Minister himself, who has the ability to inspire so much change, and indeed campaigned on real change, cannot even respect his own colleagues? Mr. Speaker, it's not for us to determine the intent of the Prime Minister's actions were. Only he knows truly what his actions were and what his intent was. But offering excuses for the offender, which is what we saw afterwards, minimizing the impact on our colleague from the NDP, minimizing it. And then when our colleague from the NDP composed herself and managed to come back into the House and talk about the impact, we saw eyes rolling and laughs from the other side, minimizing it. Mr. Speaker, that is a problem with what we have, not just in this House, but outside in society, turning a blind eye and making excuses for what happened. Mr. Speaker, we all should be doing what we can to stop this kind of behavior, Mr. Speaker, and not making excuses for the offender. Why it happened. He didn't mean to. He's such a nice guy.
He was really heated.
Mr. Speaker, the excuses that we heard earlier on are a typical, if it was a domestic abuse case and the abuser and the offender was standing before, I didn't mean to. I didn't know what I was doing.
Exactly.
I didn't mean to hurt the person. Mr. Speaker, it's unacceptable. I just don't understand it, Mr. Speaker, and I was shocked and appalled. This is not a playground, nor is it a baseball game or a hockey game. I think I speak for all members when I say that this is not the legacy that we want to leave. This is not the legacy that any of us came here to leave. Mr. Speaker, even more disappointing was when the discussion debate started, the Prime Minister chose to leave, Mr. Speaker, and not hear how his actions impacted us. Mr. Speaker, as if that discussion was not worthy of his time. It's unacceptable. I mentioned it earlier in the questions, earlier in this debate. If he truly, truly meant what he said and was apologizing, he would be here listening right from the start about how that impacted us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it is a privilege to sit as Prime Minister. Canadians elected a Prime Minister to what is arguably the most powerful position in this country. He ran an entire campaign on change, Mr. Speaker. This is not change. In fact, it is the opposite. People praise democracy around the world because it allows people to have a voice, and they expect their members of Parliament to carry their voices forward on their behalf. Not Ottawa carry the voice to our riding, but the riding to carry our voice here. A majority government or any number of seats in this House does not give you the right to stifle debate. It does not give you the authority to manhandle other parliamentarians. It does not give you to stifle members because your ego is bruised. And it certainly does not give you the right to be aggressive and attack another member of Parliament, either verbally or physically. This House belongs to the people, Mr. Speaker, not us, not me, and most certainly not the Prime Minister. Motion 6, closure, asserting his authority, all that we've seen over the last 6 months, sticking his tongue out, childish behaviors. Perhaps, again, Mr. Speaker, a Prime Minister, a Member of Parliament that just was not ready. Mr. Speaker, I ask one final thing, and I'm speaking as a father and as a husband, and I know the Prime Minister is as well. If this happened to any of his kids or his wife, how would he stand by? How would he react? Thank you.
Before we go to questions and comments, just a reminder to honourable members, particularly when recounting the events of yesterday, which has given rise to the debate today, that in their remarks, in terms of making reference to the absence or presence of honourable members is something that is not permitted in the standing orders, so just to keep that in mind in terms of their comments and or speeches. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Essex.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague for his excellent speech in this place here today. I think he speaks for all of us in saying that we need to raise the level of decorum in this place, and where we've devolved to over the last few days has become a shock to many of us. And I don't believe just those of us sitting on this side of the House. I have to believe that there are members opposite who are also engaged in becoming a Member of Parliament to have that exact change that you spoke about, to do something better, to represent people, and stifling opposition parties, stifling other MPs in their ability to represent the people that they're elected here to do so is not the way to do that. So I have to imagine that there are members opposite who would agree with that as well. We all signed a code of conduct when we entered into this Parliament, this session, a code of conduct that said that we would be in a harassment-free place here inside this House of Commons, which is part of our workplace, and we've heard that spoken to today very well. I want to be clear, though, that in order to restore this decorum, I think it's incredibly important that the government immediately back away from this unacceptable proposal to strong-arm the opposition in Parliament. And I would like to ask the member if he would agree with that statement. Honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, again, that motion 6 is what we saw as, again, we saw a government, we saw a leader that is saying, well, I'll show you, and how dare you question my authority. Mr. Speaker, whether it is the closure on the debate, whether on perhaps the most impactful piece of legislation that our generation will ever see, we are debating pipelines longer than we are debating assisted suicide. Mr. Speaker, it is unacceptable. Mr. Speaker, motion 6 fundamentally puts closure on any debate, anything, and it has never been seen before in the history of our Parliament. Mr. Speaker, it just shows that they will go to any length to make sure that Canadians' voices are not heard.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Foothills.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And we've talked a lot over the last day and a half about the incidents that may have led to what happened yesterday. And I want to take this from a different angle. I don't feel that the mood in the House yesterday before the vote was heated at all. In fact, there was nothing really going on prior to the incident. I feel that there's a lot of excuses going on what led to the Honourable Prime Minister from leaving his seat to walk across. But what really struck me in all of this is I would hold our Prime Minister to a much higher standard. And they're talking about the tone in this House. Well, the Prime Minister is the person who should be setting this tone. And he certainly set the tone yesterday, a tone that I don't think as parliamentarians we should be following. So I would like to ask my colleague, certainly the feedback I'm getting from my constituents is not necessarily who is impacted, but the fact that the Prime Minister of Canada rose out of his seat and in what I could describe as a huff, walked across the floor and grabbed another member. I think that our Prime Minister should be held to a much higher standard, and I'm embarrassed that our Prime Minister took these actions, and I would like my honourable colleague to just talk about what he feels the Prime Minister and the tone that he set yesterday.
The honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Mr. Speaker, I've said this right from day one. Again, I'm a coach. I have a small business owner, but leadership comes from the top, and actions speak louder than words, Mr. Speaker. And we have seen the actions over the last 6 months. And I will tell you again, I'm going to reiterate it again. Outside of this House, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been very generous to me with my constituents when I've had somebody there that would like to meet the Prime Minister. But in this House, Mr. Speaker, I've seen complete disregard and childish actions. And all of us, our tone is set from our leader, whether he's our leader on this side, but he is our leader of our country, Mr. Speaker. And actions such as that is unacceptable here or in any workplace.